In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where waves crash against volcanic shores and stars guide voyagers across endless blue horizons, there exists a figure whose exploits echo across thousands of islands. His name is Maui. Not a god in the fullest sense, but something perhaps more remarkable. A demigod, born of divine and mortal blood, whose cunning and audacity reshaped the very world we inhabit. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale, if you're fascinated by the rich tapestry of world mythology and want to explore more legendary figures from across the Pacific and beyond, consider subscribing to support this channel. Now let us begin the story of Polynesia's greatest hero. Maui's story begins not with triumph, but with abandonment. According to traditions recorded across Polynesia, Maui was born prematurely to his mother Taranga. In some versions, she was the wife of Makeatutara, a deity and guardian of the underworld. In others, she was a goddess in her own right. Believing her child was stillborn or too weak to survive, Taranga wrapped the infant's body in a tuft of her hair and cast him into the sea. This act, which might seem cruel to modern sensibilities, was the beginning of Maui's supernatural journey. The bundle containing the infant drifted on the ocean currents until it reached the shore, where jellyfish and sea foam kept the child alive. Here, different traditions diverge. In many accounts, it was Tamanui ki te rangi, an ancestor spirit or sky father figure, who discovered the abandoned child and raised him in the celestial realm. The tuft of his mother's hair remained with him, and Maui wore this topknot throughout his life, a reminder of both his abandonment and his destiny. When Maui finally returned to the mortal world, he was transformed, imbued with supernatural powers and an insatiable curiosity. His mother Taranga had other sons, typically 4 in most traditions, though the number varies by island group. He sought out his mother and his 4 older brothers, Maui Taha, Maui Rodo, Maui Pai, and Maui Waho. The brothers, who had grown up knowing nothing of this youngest sibling, were initially suspicious and dismissive. But Taranga recognized her son by the top knot of her own hair, and the family was reunited. Yet Maui would always be an outsider among his brothers, the youngest and most audacious, constantly seeking to prove himself through increasingly impossible deeds. Much of Maui's legend focuses on his heroic deeds. He also lived as a man among mortals. He took a wife, though her name varies by tradition. In New Zealand Maori tradition, his wife was Hinauri. The details of Maui's children are less consistently recorded across the oral traditions, though some accounts mention offspring who inherited aspects of their father's remarkable nature. What remains consistent across traditions is that Maui never sought to build an empire or establish a royal line. His motivations were always more immediate and personal. Curiosity, the desire to prove himself to his brothers, the urge to solve problems that affected his family and community. In this way, Maui represents a very human kind of hero, despite his divine heritage. Maui, as a being who walked between the world of mortals and gods, bore tattoos that reflected his unique nature. The traditions speak of his body being marked with patterns that told the story of his deeds, his genealogy, and his supernatural power. In some Hawaiian traditions, Maui's tattoos were said to be gifts from the gods themselves, inscribed with magical properties that enhanced his shape-shifting abilities and protected him in his dangerous exploits. These sacred markings served multiple purposes. They were armor and identity, genealogy made visible, and channels for divine power. When Maui transformed into a hawk to escape Mahuika's flames, or into a lizard to enter the goddess of death, some traditions suggest his tattoos shifted with him, adapting to each new form. The patterns themselves varied by tradition, but often included motifs common across Polynesian tattooing. Geometric designs representing the ocean and navigation, symbols of ancestors and gods, and markings that denoted his status as one who had accomplished impossible feats. Each tattoo was earned, not given lightly, and together they formed a map of Maui's journey from abandoned infant to legendary hero. In this way, Maui's body became a living text, readable to those who understood the sacred language of Polynesian tattoo art. Perhaps no feat better demonstrates Maui's combination of cunning and concern for humanity than his snaring of the sun. In those ancient days, the sun raced across the sky so quickly that people barely had time to complete their daily tasks. Fishermen returned with empty nets, farmers could not tend their crops properly, and food could not be dried or cooked adequately. The world suffered under these brief, frantic days. Maui observed his mother's frustration as she tried to make bark cloth, or tapa, but found that the sun set before the cloth could dry. According to traditions preserved in New Zealand Maori lore, as recorded in the lore of the Wairwananga, Maui's mother complained that she toiled in vain, for the sun moved too swiftly across the heavens. Determined to help, Maui convinced his brothers to join him on an expedition to the edge of the world, where the sun began its daily journey. They traveled eastward, moving by night and resting by day to avoid the sun's notice. Maui brought with him ropes woven from flax fibers that he had blessed with magical incantations. The strength of these ropes would be crucial, for they needed to bind nothing less than the celestial fire itself. When they reached the great pit from which the sun emerged each morning, Maui and his brothers constructed a trap. They created a noose and positioned themselves, waiting through the cold night. As dawn approached and the sun began to rise, Maui sprang his trap. The ropes caught the sun's rays like legs, and Maui pulled tight, snaring the celestial body before it could escape into the sky. The sun thrashed and burned, furious at being captured. But Maui was prepared. He beat the sun with a magical jawbone. In most traditions, this was the jawbone of his ancestress Muriranga Wenua, which possessed great mana, or spiritual power. With each blow, he demanded that the sun slow its journey across the sky. The sun, weakened and humbled, finally agreed to move more slowly, giving humanity longer days to work, to grow food, and to live their lives fully. If snaring the sun expanded time for humanity, Maui's next great feat would expand the very land they lived upon. The legend of Maui fishing up islands is perhaps his most geographically significant achievement, for it explains the very existence of the Pacific Islands themselves. The most detailed version of this legend concerns the North Island of New Zealand, which the Maori call Te Ika a Maui, the fish of Maui. As recounted in various sources, including Sir George Gray's Polynesian Mythology, Maui went fishing with his brothers. They were reluctant to take him, knowing his trickster nature often led to trouble, but he persisted until they agreed. The brothers paddled their canoe far out to sea, to waters they believed held no fish. But Maui had brought his own hook, a magical fishhook carved from the jawbone of his grandmother, bound with a sacred cord and imbued with powerful incantations. When his brothers mocked him for having no bait, Maui struck his own nose until blood flowed, then smeared this blood upon his hook. His own essence, divine and mortal combined, would serve as the ultimate bait. He cast his line into the depths, chanting ancient karakia, ritual incantations that called upon the powers of the deep ocean and the ancestors who dwelt in the underworld. The line sank deeper and deeper, past schools of fish, past the realm where ordinary hooks could reach, down to the very floor of the ocean itself. Then came a tremendous pull. Maui had hooked something far larger than any fish. He called to his brothers to paddle, to help him draw up this great catch, but warned them with fierce intensity that they must not look back, must not examine what they had caught, until he had properly performed the rituals to settle it. This was crucial, for what Maui had hooked was no ordinary fish, but the land itself resting on the ocean floor. The brothers paddled with all their might as Maui pulled on his line. The ocean churned and boiled. Mountains began to rise from beneath the waves, dripping with seawater and trailing kelp. The roar of creation itself filled the air, as land that had slumbered beneath the ocean for eons emerged into the sunlight. But the brothers, overcome with curiosity and perhaps doubt, turned to look at their catch. They saw not a fish, but mountainous land, and in their excitement or fear, they began to cut at it with their knives, trying to claim portions for themselves. This violation of Maui's instructions had consequences. Their hacking and cutting created the mountains, valleys, and rugged terrain of the land. Had they waited for Maui to complete his rituals, the land would have been smooth and perfect. This legend is told with variations across Polynesia. In Hawaiian tradition, the islands were similarly fished up by Maui, and his magical hook is said to have been called Manaya Kalani. In Tongan tradition, Maui fished up Tongatapu and other islands. Each island group preserves its own version, but the essential elements remain. Maui's cunning, his magical fishhook, and his role as the creator or revealer of the lands upon which Pacific peoples built their civilizations. In the time before Maui's intervention, humanity lived in cold and darkness, eating raw food and huddling together for warmth. Fire existed, but it was kept in the underworld by Mahuika, the goddess of fire and earthquakes, who guarded it jealously. In some traditions, Mahuika is described as Maui's ancestress, which adds another layer to their confrontation. Maui, seeing humanity's suffering, decided to obtain fire for mortals. He descended into the underworld, navigating its dark passages until he reached Mahuika's domain. The goddess of fire appeared before him, her body emanating heat, her fingernails and toenails each containing a flame, for this is where she stored the essence of fire itself. Using his characteristic charm and wit, Maui convinced Mahuika to give him fire. She pulled off one of her fingernails, which burned with living flame, and gave it to him. But Maui, being Maui, could not simply take this gift and leave. He wanted to understand fire's nature, to test its limits. He extinguished the flame in a stream, then returned to Mahuika, claiming he had lost it and needed another. Mahuika obliged, giving him a second flaming fingernail. Again, Maui extinguished it and returned. This pattern repeated, with Mahuika growing increasingly suspicious and angry, until she had given him every fingernail and all but one toenail. When Maui came back yet again, Mahuika realized she had been tricked. Enraged, she threw her last flaming toenail at Maui, but instead of simply giving him the fire, she threw it to the earth itself, setting the world ablaze. Flames spread everywhere, threatening to consume everything, including Maui himself. He fled, transforming into a hawk to escape the inferno. In some traditions, this is why the hawk's plumage shows signs of scorching even today. Maui called upon his ancestor Tauhira Matea, god of winds and storms, to send rain. Torrential rains fell, dousing the flames and saving Maui and the world. But Mahuika, knowing her fire was about to be completely extinguished, cast the last sparks into trees, particularly the Kaikomako, Maho, Tatara, and Pukatea trees in Maori tradition, though different traditions name different trees. This is why, ever after, humans could create fire by rubbing together certain types of wood. The fire that Maui had stolen was now hidden within the trees themselves, waiting to be released by those who knew the secret. In the earliest times, according to many Polynesian traditions, the sky hung so low that it pressed down upon the earth. People could not stand upright, they crawled and crouched, living in a narrow space between earth and sky. This was the legacy of the separation of Ranjanui the Sky Father and Papatuanuku the Earth Mother, but the separation had been incomplete. Maui, seeing humanity's predicament, determined to lift the sky higher. Using his immense strength that was both physical and spiritual, derived from his divine heritage and his mastery of magical incantations, Maui braced himself against the earth and pushed upward. The sky resisted, for it had rested upon the earth since the beginning of time. But Maui pushed harder, chanting words of power, calling upon the strength of his ancestors and the mana that flowed through his divine blood. Finally, with one tremendous effort, Maui thrust the sky upward to its current height, where it has remained ever since. Humanity could now stand upright, could build structures, could live as they were meant to live. The world had expanded not just in land, through his fishing up of islands, and not just in time, through his snaring of the sun, but now also in space, giving people room to breathe and grow. As time passes, Maui notices that each evening his mother, Taranga, disappears, only to return before dawn. Curious about her nightly absences, he follows her one evening and watches as she enters a hollow tree. Through it, she descends into the earth, passing into the underworld, known as Miru or Hawaii, depending on the tradition. There, Maui discovers that his mother visits his father, Makeatutara, each night. Maui follows her into the underworld and finds his father's dwelling. At first, Makeatutara does not recognize his youngest son, for he has never seen him before. To prove his identity, Maui recounts his many deeds, reveals his powers of shapeshifting, and shares knowledge of family secrets known only to kin. Convinced at last, Maketutara embraces him, and father and son are reunited. Maketutara then performs a ritual over Maui, akin to a baptism, acknowledging him fully as his son. During this moment, he reveals a grave truth. An error was made during Maui's birth rituals. In some versions of the legend, Maketutara stutters or mispronounces sacred words during the incantations, words that must be spoken perfectly to ensure complete divine protection. Because the ritual is flawed and left unfinished, Maui, despite his divine ancestry and supernatural powers, remains vulnerable to death. In other traditions, the fault lies not in the incantation, but in Maui's birth itself. Born prematurely, he is believed by his mother Taranga to be stillborn and is cast into the sea. The essential ceremonies that should have protected him are never properly performed. Though Maui survives, rescued and raised by his ancestor, and is later reunited with his family, the sacred window for completing these rites has already passed. This imperfection, hidden beneath Maui's brilliance and power, becomes crucial in his final and most dangerous adventure. All of Maui's achievements, slowing the sun, fishing up lands, obtaining fire, lifting the sky, were impressive, but they were mortal achievements, things that improved life but did not change its fundamental nature. Humanity still died, and Maui, for all his divine blood, was also mortal. He too would die. This reality gnawed at him, and he began to contemplate the ultimate challenge, conquering death itself. In the deepest parts of the underworld dwelt Hinenui Tepo, the great goddess of night and death. She was a formidable figure, a primordial being whose very existence represented the inevitability of mortality. Her body was said to be immense, with eyes of jade and teeth of obsidian, sharp as volcanic glass. Maui learned of a prophecy or conceived of a plan. If he could enter the body of Hinenui Tepo while she slept, pass through her, and emerge from her mouth, he could reverse the process of death itself. By being born anew from the goddess of death, he could achieve immortality, not just for himself, but potentially for all humanity. This would be his greatest trick, his ultimate feat of audacity. He gathered companions for this final journey. In most versions, these were birds, which in Polynesian tradition often served as messengers between the mortal world and the spiritual realm. The birds included the Piwakawaka, the Miramiro, the Tiwaiwaka, and others, depending on the tradition. Maui gave them strict instructions. They must remain absolutely silent while he attempted his feat. Any sound, any disturbance could wake the goddess, and all would be lost. They found Hinenui Tepo sleeping, her massive form breathing with the rhythm of tides, her presence filling the cavern of the underworld with the weight of endings. Maui prepared himself, stripped off his clothes to move more freely, and began his attempt. He started to enter the sleeping goddess, moving slowly and carefully. The birds watched in tense silence as Maui progressed in his audacious plan. He was halfway through, approaching the point where success seemed possible, when the Piwakawaka, the fantail, a small bird known for its erratic, flitting movements, could no longer contain itself. The fantail burst into laughter. The sound shattered the silence. Hinenui Tepo awoke instantly, and realizing what was happening, closed her obsidian teeth. Maui was crushed to death, killed by the very embodiment of death he had sought to defeat. This was the end of Maui. The great hero, the trickster demigod who had reshaped the world and challenged the gods themselves, was defeated not by his own failure, but by the failure of his companion to follow instructions. Because Maui died, death remained in the world. His quest for immortality, the one challenge he could not overcome, ensured that mortals would continue to follow the natural cycle of life and death. Beyond these great deeds, countless smaller stories circulated about Maui's trickster nature. He was known for shape-shifting, transforming into birds, insects, or other creatures to accomplish his goals or escape consequences. His magical abilities came from both his divine heritage and the rituals and knowledge he had acquired. There are tales of Maui tricking chiefs, outwitting monsters, and solving seemingly impossible problems through cleverness rather than strength. In one story, he extended the length of the day not through the dramatic snaring of the sun, but through magical incantations that manipulated time itself. In another, he created the first dog or introduced certain food plants to humanity. The stories of Maui are told and retold. The details shift with each island group, each culture adding its own understanding and emphasis. In some places, he is more trickster than hero. In others, he is a figure of reverence, a being who genuinely cared for humanity despite his flaws. In Hawaii, he is known for additional feats, including the creation of the Hawaiian Islands and various other exploits particular to that island group. What remains consistent is Maui's essential nature. He was the breaker of boundaries, the challenger of limits, the figure who refused to accept that things must be as they always had been. He was neither fully god nor fully mortal, and perhaps this in-between state, this liminality, gave him the perspective to see what needed changing, and the audacity to attempt it. He gave humanity longer days, new lands, fire, and space to stand upright. He could not give them immortality, but perhaps his other gifts were enough. Thank you for joining me on this episode. If you've enjoyed this journey through the legends of Maui and want to explore more figures from Polynesian mythology and world traditions, please subscribe and continue this voyage through the stories that have shaped human culture across the oceans of the world.